Over 900,000 men served in the Nazi SS during World War II, an organization central to the regime's most brutal operations. After the war, many evaded justice through forged identities, secret networks, and shifting political climates. This is the concealed legacy of the SS in the aftermath of Nazi Germany's fall. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, the world turned its eyes to justice. But for many of the men who had served in the SS, the Nazi regime's most loyal and brutal enforcers, the end of the war was only the beginning of a new, darker chapter. As Germany lay in ruins, thousands of SS soldiers slipped through the cracks. Some caught in war crime tribunals, others vanishing into rural towns, foreign cities, or secret government programs. The Schutzstaffel, or SS, had been at the heart of the Nazi machine. They ran the concentration camps, crushed resistance, and carried out unspeakable atrocities across occupied Europe. But after the fall of Berlin, the world was unprepared for the vast number of perpetrators still at large, and often conflicted about how to deal with them. Some would be hunted down, some would be quietly absorbed into new systems, and others would spend the rest of their lives hiding in plain sight. In this video, we follow the post-war paths of former SS soldiers from the gallows of Nuremberg to the jungles of South America, the offices of intelligence agencies, and the faded shadows of forgotten towns, revealing a story that history almost left behind. Chapter 1: Trials and Tribunals. In the aftermath of Nazi Germany's collapse, the fate of the SS, the regime's most feared paramilitary force, was placed squarely in the hands of the Allied powers. As cities lay in ruins and concentration camps stood as grim evidence of industrial-scale genocide, the victors of the Second World War began their search for justice. The SS, or Schutzstaffel, had not only enforced Nazi ideology, but had orchestrated and executed many of its darkest crimes. Now, with the war over, its members became the prime targets of retribution and accountability. The first major reckoning came with the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945. These landmark proceedings were not only about punishing individuals, but establishing a new legal framework. Among the 24 high-profile defendants were several leading SS officials, including Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer to face the court. He was charged with crimes against humanity for his role in orchestrating the deportation and extermination of millions. The SS itself was declared a criminal organization, a move that marked every one of its members as potentially complicit in war crimes. The courtroom in Nuremberg became a theater of evidence. Reels of film, confiscated documents, and harrowing survivor testimonies. These were not distant crimes buried in the chaos of war. They were structured, methodical, and carried out by men in uniform with bureaucratic precision. Kaltenbrunner was sentenced to death and hanged in October 1946. The precedent had been set. The SS was guilty, and its members would be pursued. But justice did not stop at the marble walls of Nuremberg. In other zones of occupied Germany, the Allies initiated a sprawling series of follow-up trials. These included the Dachau military tribunals, where over 1,600 individuals, many of them SS guards, administrators, and doctors, were tried for atrocities committed in camps like Mauthausen and Buchenwald. These trials focused less on ideology and more on direct involvement. Evidence included transport records, orders for executions, and the testimony of survivors who pointed to specific guards by name. One of the more infamous post-war prosecutions was the Belsen trial, where British authorities tried former staff of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Among them was Irma Grace, a 22-year-old SS guard nicknamed the Hyena of Auschwitz by survivors. Her cruelty, testified to by multiple witnesses, made her one of the most recognizable faces of female perpetrators. She was found guilty and hanged in December 1945. In Poland and the Soviet Union, justice took a different shape. These nations, having borne the brunt of Nazi occupation, were less restrained in their trials. In some cases, proceedings were swift and politically driven. Hundreds of SS men, particularly those captured near camps like Majdanek and Treblinka, were executed after brief trials. While some historians argue that these lacked due process, others contend that they delivered a measure of justice that the West hesitated to impose. Despite these efforts, the scale of the SS made full accountability impossible. The organization had swelled to over 800,000 members by the end of the war. Not all had blood on their hands, but many had served in units that facilitated genocide, repression, and terror. As the trials continued, legal debates emerged. Was simply being a member of the SS enough to warrant prosecution? Did conscripts who claimed ignorance deserve the same punishment as ideologues? The courts wrestled with these questions. In the American zone, judges began differentiating between those with direct involvement in crimes and those who served in more peripheral roles. Sentences varied wildly. Some received death, others long prison terms, and many walked free within a few years. By the early 1950s, as Cold War politics took center stage, priorities shifted. Stability in West Germany became more important than exhaustive denazification. Many SS men who had been convicted saw their sentences commuted or shortened. Pressure from the German public, combined with the emerging threat of the Soviet bloc, led to mass releases. Former SS personnel reintegrated into society, often quietly. Some returned to civilian jobs, others entered public service. A few even climbed political or corporate ladders, their pasts overlooked or deliberately ignored. For survivors of the camps and the families of victims, this reintegration was a bitter pill. Organizations formed to monitor war criminals and lobby for continued investigations. Among the most prominent was the work of Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor turned Nazi hunter who dedicated his life to tracking down unpunished SS men. Thanks to his efforts and those of others, several high-profile fugitives were exposed in later decades. The legacy of the post-war trials is complex. On one hand, they introduced the concept of crimes against humanity and established international law precedents still in use today. They showed the world that state power could not excuse mass murder. On the other hand, the sheer number of untried SS members left a lingering sense of incomplete justice. Thousands slipped through the cracks, aided by false papers, sympathetic networks, or sheer anonymity. One former SS officer, Karl Gebhardt, had served as a physician in concentration camps and conducted lethal medical experiments. Though tried and executed, Many of his colleagues in similar positions managed to avoid prosecution entirely. Others changed names, moved abroad, or blended back into German towns under assumed identities. The SS, once a symbol of Nazi strength, had fragmented into 1,000,000 individual stories, some known, many lost to history. The trials and tribunals were a first step, a moral and legal statement that what the SS had done would not be forgotten or excused. But they were also a reflection of post-war realpolitik. The Allies were builders now, not just judges. And as Germany was reconstructed, old enemies were sometimes seen as useful tools in a new global struggle. The SS was shattered, but not erased. Its members scattered, some to prison, some to the gallows, many into the shadows. The pursuit of justice had begun, but for those who escaped it, a new life awaited, and with it, a new chapter in the legacy of one of history's most reviled institutions. Chapter 2: Escape, Reinvention, and Silent Return. As the dust of war settled over a divided Europe, many former SS members took advantage of the confusion, displacement, and bureaucratic gaps to quietly disappear. Some vanished across borders, others melded back into civilian life, and a considerable number found refuge within the very societies they had helped devastate. The post-war world was one of shifting allegiances, Cold War paranoia, and fragile political rebuilding. In this uncertain landscape, thousands of SS men managed to avoid justice not through cunning alone, but because the world quickly became more interested in stability than retribution. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Allied powers established denazification programs meant to identify and remove Nazis and SS affiliates from positions of power. But as millions of Germans were processed through tribunals and interviews, the sheer scale of the task became overwhelming. Many SS members claimed they had been conscripted or worked in administrative roles, far removed from the front lines or death camps. With forged documents, new identities, and false testimonies, countless individuals slipped through the cracks. The situation was particularly chaotic in the refugee camps of occupied Germany. Displaced persons from across Europe were being repatriated, resettled, or relocated. Within this churn of humanity, former SS men adopted new names and joined the exodus. Some posed as ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, others as ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. Documents were easily lost or forged, and background checks were inconsistent. International aid organizations and overstretched Allied personnel often couldn't tell the difference. One of the most well-known escape networks was Odessa, the organization Der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, though its existence remains debated among historians. What is not in dispute is that numerous former SS officers made their way to South America using clandestine routes supported by sympathetic clergy, former Nazi officials, and occasionally even elements within Western intelligence services. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile became havens for hundreds of fugitives. Some changed identities completely, others lived under their real names, protected by local regimes or communities that shared their ideology. In West Germany, reintegration became the silent norm. By the 1950s, the Cold War had transformed the political landscape. The Western Allies, particularly the United States, viewed a strong West Germany as essential to countering Soviet expansion. As a result, many former Nazis, including SS members, were quietly allowed to return to professional life. Some re-entered the civil service, joined the police force, or took academic positions. In smaller towns and rural areas, former SS men resumed lives as teachers, farmers, or shopkeepers, their pasts an unspoken truth. The German government, newly formed and under pressure to demonstrate both stability and independence, had enacted amnesty laws in the 1950s that further reduced sentences for wartime crimes. Many SS veterans benefited from these legal shifts. Files were sealed, names redacted, and investigations quietly dropped. Within a decade, the majority of those convicted in the post-war trials were free. Former concentration camp guards walked the same streets as their victims' descendants. This uneasy peace was not universal. In East Germany, the Soviet-backed regime maintained a hard line against former SS members, imprisoning or executing many. But even there, selective enforcement was common. Those deemed politically useful or cooperative often received leniency. Some were even recruited into the East German security apparatus, their experience repurposed under a new ideological banner. Internationally, the hunt for SS fugitives continued, albeit sporadically. The most notable efforts came from independent Nazi hunters and Israeli intelligence. In 1960, Mossad famously abducted Adolf Eichmann from Buenos Aires and brought him to trial in Jerusalem. His capture reignited global interest in the Holocaust and the escape of SS war criminals. Yet, Eichmann was the exception, not the rule. For every fugitive captured, dozens remained free. Simon Wiesenthal and others kept compiling lists, collecting testimonies, and lobbying governments to act. Occasionally, a former SS man would be exposed, often decades later, living a quiet life under an assumed name. Trials would reopen, newspapers would explode with headlines, and the public would briefly revisit a past many preferred to forget. But these were moments, not movements. The psychological toll on both victims and perpetrators was immense. Survivors had to live with the knowledge that their tormentors might be living next door, unpunished and unrepentant. Former SS members, meanwhile, often adopted narratives of victimhood, insisting they were scapegoats or minor players in a vast system. Some formed veterans associations that openly defended their records and sought to rewrite history. By the 1970s, the passage of time further complicated justice. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and physical evidence decayed. Prosecutions became harder to win. Political will dwindled. Only the most high-profile or egregious cases drew attention. Meanwhile, a younger generation of Germans began confronting the Nazi legacy with more openness, demanding historical reckoning even as their elders remained silent. Still, not all escapes were successful. In 1979, the American government established the Office of Special Investigations to identify and deport former Nazis living in the United States. Dozens were tracked down, stripped of citizenship, and expelled. Other countries followed suit. But these actions came late, often when the individuals were old, sick, or near death. What this chapter of history reveals is not merely the cunning of SS fugitives, but the moral ambiguity of a world that allowed so many to vanish. The priorities of the Cold War, the limitations of post-war bureaucracy, and the psychological need to move on all conspired to let thousands of SS men fade into anonymity. Their reinvention was not just personal, it was systemic, facilitated by nations that chose to look ahead rather than dwell on the past. Yet the silence did not erase the crimes, nor did time absolve the guilt. The legacy of these men and the choices made by those who sheltered them remains a haunting shadow over the post-war era, a reminder that justice, delayed or denied, leaves deep and lasting scars. Chapter 3. Escape Routes and Fugitives Abroad. As post-war Europe descended into rubble, chaos, and confusion, thousands of SS men vanished, not through mere luck or happenstance, but through a deliberately engineered system of escape. These clandestine exit paths, later dubbed the rat lines, were neither accidental nor marginal. They were coldly systematic, bolstered by sympathizers, exploited bureaucracy, and geopolitical disarray. The rat lines represented a convergence of desperation and opportunity. The desperation of SS fugitives facing justice, and the opportunity presented by disintegrated border controls, sympathetic clergy, and disillusioned institutions. At the heart of this escape infrastructure was the southern European corridor, especially Italy, where ports, refugee camps, and clerical protections converged. The city of Rome, war-battered and diplomatically ambiguous, became a central node. Within its ecclesiastical shadows operated key figures like Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric, stationed at the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima. Hudal, driven by virulent anti-communism and a revisionist understanding of justice, used his Vatican ties to issue shelter and forged identity papers to fleeing Nazis. He helped them secure Red Cross passports under false names, facilitating their passage out of Europe, typically via Genoa. His defenders argued his motivations were spiritual or humanitarian. Critics, however, saw them as nothing less than ideological collaboration. Through Hudal and his network, SS men who had overseen ghettos, death camps, and mass executions found sanctuary within church-run boarding houses, hiding in plain sight behind cassocks and crucifixes. The rat lines depended heavily on forged or poorly verified travel documents, particularly those issued by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Overwhelmed by the refugee crisis, the Red Cross operated in haste, and identity verification protocols were rudimentary at best. Exploiting these weaknesses, war criminals obtained displaced persons' identity cards and immigration papers under false names. Men who had orchestrated genocide became technicians, clerks, or refugees from Bolshevism, while sympathetic embassies, most notably Argentina's, expedited travel arrangements. In a world gripped by the rising specter of communism, many receiving governments prioritized ideological alignment over judicial due process. And so, the ships began to sail. Nowhere did this post-war exodus find a warmer welcome than in Argentina, under the regime of President Juan Perón. Perón, a populist enamored with European fascist aesthetics and determined to elevate Argentina's geopolitical profile, saw value in harboring exiled Europeans. His government adopted a dual-pronged approach, opening the doors to war criminals while cultivating plausible deniability. Former Nazis were seen as ideologically compatible, professionally capable, and useful in Argentina's industrial and military modernization. The rat lines led directly to Buenos Aires, where newly arrived SS fugitives were provided with papers, housing, and employment. Some were absorbed into government-sponsored industries. Others simply blended into the growing expatriate German communities in Cordoba and Patagonia. One of the most notorious beneficiaries of this system was Adolf Eichmann, logistical mastermind of the Holocaust. After briefly being held by U.S. forces in 1945, Eichmann escaped detection and went underground in Germany, aided by a network of former SS comrades. By 1950, he had made his way to Italy, acquired false documents, and embarked for Argentina under the alias Ricardo Clement. Settling in a modest suburb of Buenos Aires, he found work first in factories, later with Mercedes-Benz, and lived in anonymity for nearly a decade. His undoing came not from any government effort, but from a survivor's tip. Lothar Hermann, a blind Jewish exile, alerted Israeli authorities after his daughter unknowingly dated Eichmann's son. In 1960, a covert Mossad team abducted Eichmann and smuggled him to Israel. His 1961 trial in Jerusalem, broadcast globally, was a landmark in international justice. Eichmann, emotionless in the glass defendant's box, declared he had merely followed orders. He was executed in 1962. His trial forced the world to confront the banality of evil and spotlighted the efficiency with which post-war systems had failed to reckon with Nazi fugitives. But Eichmann was not alone. Franz Stangl, commandant of the Sobibor and Treblinka death camps, similarly evaded capture after the war. Assisted by ratline networks, he traveled through Italy and reached Brazil. For years, he worked comfortably in a São Paulo Volkswagen factory. It wasn't until 1967 that German authorities, with information provided by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, arrested and extradited him. During his trial, Stangl admitted his role but claimed he was a mere cog in a larger machine. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970, dying the following year. His late capture highlighted both the immense difficulty of hunting fugitives abroad and the moral complexities of prosecuting middle-level SS personnel who framed their actions as administrative necessity. Beyond the high-profile cases, hundreds, possibly thousands of lower-ranking SS officers and collaborators made similar journeys. These men, their names largely unknown to history, settled into quiet lives in Paraguay, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, and beyond. Some worked as teachers, farmers, or tradesmen. Others integrated to expatriate German communities, where their wartime pasts were politely ignored or concealed under euphemisms. Governments in these countries, often run by right-wing or military regimes, either lacked the political will or actively protected these men. Alfredo Stroessner's Paraguay was particularly hospitable, offering citizenship to war criminals like Josef Mengele, Auschwitz's infamous Angel of Death. Mengele moved freely between Paraguay and Brazil for decades, shielded by Nazi sympathizers, Catholic networks, and the general disinterest of international authorities. He drowned in 1979 off the coast of São Paulo. Buried under an alias, his identity confirmed only years later through forensic analysis. Despite repeated sightings and international warrants, Mengele had never been arrested, and his escape became emblematic of a global failure to deliver justice. Meanwhile, Syria and Egypt welcomed former SS officers for different reasons. As anti-Zionist sentiment mounted, and military confrontations with Israel intensified, Arab nationalist governments saw practical value in the expertise of Nazi fugitives. Former SS intelligence officers, chemists, and military advisors were recruited to train security forces, develop propaganda, and assist in counterintelligence. These recruits, often protected by diplomatic channels, assumed new identities and became woven into the fabric of post-colonial Middle Eastern security apparatuses. For example, Alois Brunner, Eichmann's deputy and a key figure in deporting Jews from France, was widely reported to have lived in Syria, serving the Assad regime in various intelligence roles. Brunner was never brought to trial and reportedly died in Damascus, unrepentant and defiant. Over time, this web of escape routes, fake identities, and governmental complicity began to unravel, not because of formal diplomatic pressure, but due to the relentless work of individual pursuers. Foremost among them was Simon Wiesenthal, an Austrian survivor who lost most of his family in the Holocaust. Refusing to let memory fade, Wiesenthal founded the Jewish Documentation Center in Vienna and spent decades tracking fugitives, compiling dossiers, and lobbying for action. His efforts bore fruit not just in the Eichmann and Stengel captures, but in hundreds of lesser-known cases. Wiesenthal believed that history must be personalized, that even the least-known SS guard should be named, documented, and remembered for their crimes. Despite such efforts, many host nations remained reluctant to extradite. Some cited legal loopholes, others feared political fallout. Extradition treaties were often weak or non-existent. In Argentina, for example, extradition requests often stalled for years or were ignored entirely. Only in the 1970s and 1980s, amid regime changes and growing global awareness of Holocaust memory, did some countries begin cooperating more actively. Public pressure, investigative journalism, and the emergence of Holocaust education slowly eroded the silence. Yet the silence was not only governmental. In towns and neighborhoods where these men lived, communities often turned a blind eye. In some cases, neighbors knew, or at least suspected, the truth, but chose not to speak. Whether out of fear, apathy, or latent sympathies, the complicity extended well beyond borders. The fugitives' survival was not just a testament to bureaucratic failure, but to a shared willingness to forget. Today, the rat lines remain one of the most morally troubling legacies of the post-war world. They expose how, even after the worst crimes imaginable, a combination of ideology, pragmatism, and global disarray enabled perpetrators to escape justice. They also remind us that accountability requires more than laws. It demands vigilance, memory, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth. In the dusty files of Red Cross offices, in the cellars of South American police archives, and in the testimonies of survivors who never stopped speaking, the remnants of these roots are still being traced. Each fugitive story, whether of flight, capture, or evasion, adds another piece to the unsettling mosaic of how history remembers, forgets, and finally confronts the past. Chapter 4. Cold War Utilization. In the U.S., the shift was subtle at first. While the Nuremberg trials captured headlines and projected a strong moral stance, behind the scenes, the newly formed Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, quietly began recruiting Germans with intimate knowledge of Soviet strategies, infrastructure, and intelligence networks. Many of these recruits had worn SS uniforms, worked in Nazi intelligence, or overseen operations in the occupied East, though just a few years earlier they were enemies of the United States and complicit in vast atrocities. By 1947, they were increasingly seen through a new lens, not as criminals, but as tools in the brewing ideological battle with the Soviet Union. The U.S. government knew it was crossing moral lines. Internal memoranda show unease. Some officials warned about the optics of hiring active Nazis. But the logic of the Cold War was already taking root. These men had first-hand experience in Soviet-held territory. Some had interrogated Red Army prisoners. Others had run counterinsurgency operations in Eastern Europe. Their brutality, once considered abhorrent, was now seen by some as professional expertise. One of the most telling cases was that of Otto von Bolschwing, a former SS officer who had worked closely with Adolf Eichmann. After the war, von Bolschwing offered his services to U.S. intelligence, claiming he had valuable insight into communist networks. The CIC agreed. He was smuggled into the U.S., granted citizenship, and later became an executive in the American tech industry. Only decades later did his wartime record come to light, prompting a public outcry and a quiet revocation of his citizenship just before his death. Such cases were not rare. Under Operation Paperclip, a program best known for bringing Nazi scientists like Werner von Braun to America's burgeoning space program, the U.S. government welcomed over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians. Though officially limited to those without significant Nazi affiliations, the program frequently bent those rules. Allegiances were downplayed or scrubbed entirely from official dossiers. Some of these men had direct links to the SS or the Gestapo. Their knowledge was simply too valuable. Take, for instance, Dr. Hubertus Strughold, a physician who had worked within the Nazi Aeromedical Research Division. Though never formally charged with war crimes, his name was linked to unethical experiments on prisoners at Dachau. Nevertheless, Strughold was invited to the U.S., where he helped develop medical protocols for high-altitude flight and space travel. For years, NASA honored him as a pioneer until public pressure in the 1990s forced the agency to reckon with his Nazi past. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Soviet Union was adopting similar tactics, though often with more coercion. Soviet intelligence agencies, particularly the NKVD and GRU, routinely exploited captured SS officers and former collaborators for their own strategic purposes. Some were turned into double agents. Others were used to infiltrate émigré communities or spread disinformation in the West. In the chaos of occupied Eastern Europe, lines blurred further. Some former SS men, desperate to escape Soviet tribunals, offered information in exchange for their lives. They drew maps of German defenses, identified former comrades hiding in the West, and provided dossiers on anti-Soviet insurgent groups. Some did so willingly, others under duress. Either way, the Soviet regime saw utility in those who not long ago had tried to annihilate them. Ironically, as both sides of the Cold War repurposed former SS officers for espionage, a darker symbiosis emerged. The very apparatus that had helped orchestrate genocide was now being folded into the machinery of modern intelligence. These were men who knew how to build informant networks, break resistance cells, and run clandestine operations across hostile borders. In a twisted way, they were exactly what the superpowers needed. In West Germany, this reality was institutionalized. The newly created Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, West Germany's foreign intelligence service, was built under the leadership of Reinhard Gehlen, a Wehrmacht general who had overseen intelligence on the Eastern Front. After surrendering to the Americans in 1945, Gehlen brokered a deal. He would turn over his entire intelligence archive on the Soviets in exchange for support in building a new service. Washington agreed. Gehlen was allowed to form his own agency, initially under American oversight, but staffed largely by former Nazis, many from the SS, the SD, and even the Gestapo. Gehlen argued that only those with experience in the East could properly understand Soviet threats. But in practice, this meant the BND quickly became a safe haven for men who had previously served the Nazi regime. By the 1950s, as much as 10 to 15% of the BND's personnel had some connection to the SS. This wasn't an accident. Files were sealed, names were changed, and wartime records were deliberately obscured. In some cases, agents who were being investigated by international war crimes prosecutors were simultaneously working for Western intelligence. When those contradictions became politically inconvenient, the cases were shelved or derailed. The consequences were not merely bureaucratic. Some of these men, shielded by their post-war roles, helped other SS fugitives escape justice. Alois Brunner, Eichmann's deputy, evaded capture for decades, possibly aided by the very networks meant to protect national security. In Syria, where he worked as an advisor to the Assad regime, Brunner trained secret police in surveillance and interrogation, a grim legacy of how SS expertise metastasized in new political contexts. While governments claimed these recruitments were necessary evils, survivors of the Holocaust saw them as betrayals. Many had testified in Nuremberg, hoping for closure. Instead, they learned that the men who tormented their families had simply changed uniforms. In the U.S., survivors and Jewish organizations began asking difficult questions. Who was being protected? Who had vanished into the system? By the 1970s, these concerns reached the public. Investigative journalists exposed links between the CIA and former Nazi collaborators. In response, the U.S. Justice Department established the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, in 1979, dedicated to identifying and deporting former Nazis living in America. Their work led to the revocation of dozens of citizenships, including von Bolschwing's. Declassified documents in later years revealed just how extensive the post-war compromises had been. Memos from the CIC and CIA showed that warnings about SS backgrounds were often ignored or downplayed. Some files were deliberately altered to obscure past affiliations. In the logic of the Cold War, the enemy of one's enemy, even if once a mass murderer, was worth keeping close. It wasn't just intelligence services. Former SS doctors were quietly absorbed into medical and psychiatric institutions in both East and West. Some worked on early psychotropic drug research. Others advised on trauma and interrogation techniques. A handful contributed to academic publications, their Nazi credentials quietly erased. In these circles, ethical concerns were often brushed aside with a familiar refrain: science must move forward. By the late 20th century, calls for accountability grew louder. In Germany, prosecutors reopened investigations, now armed with the knowledge that many SS men had been hidden in plain sight. Public trials, some held when the accused were in their 80s or 90s, served as symbolic reckonings. They did not undo the decades of silence, but they helped re-establish a moral boundary that Cold War pragmatism had eroded. Today, historians view this chapter not just as a footnote, but as a cautionary tale. The post-war recruitment of SS men illustrates how quickly justice can be subordinated to realpolitik. It shows how ideologies may change, but the machinery of power often remains willing to reuse whatever cogs it can find. For all the public condemnations of fascism, many Western and Eastern institutions were built in part on the expertise of those who had once served it. In retrospect, the compromise seems staggering. Men involved in genocide, repression, and ideological warfare were rebranded as patriots, experts, and protectors. Their crimes faded into background noise, replaced by their usefulness to new empires. The very skills that had enabled the SS to terrorize Europe were now turned toward new enemies. And in doing so, the moral clarity of victory in World War II began to fade into the ambiguity of the Cold War. The question remains, at what cost? Chapter 5. Memory, Reckoning, and Legacy. The collapse of the Third Reich left physical ruins, but the reckoning with its moral devastation would stretch across decades. For the SS, the legacy was uniquely toxic. Engineers of genocide, enforcers of racial policy, and operators of systematic terror. And yet, reckoning proved fragmentary, often inconsistent, and always politically entangled. By the 1970s, long dormant questions about accountability surged back into public discourse. West German prosecutors, armed with declassified intelligence archives, reopened cases, especially against mid- and low-ranking SS personnel who had previously escaped scrutiny. These were not high-profile names, but they had manned the camps, herded victims onto trains, and enforced Nazi racial law in occupied Europe. The argument that they had been just following orders now faced legal and ethical dismantling. One such case was that of John Demjanjuk, a former guard at Sobibor. He had lived quietly in the United States for decades before being extradited and convicted in Germany. His trial represented a shift. No longer was a direct order to kill required for guilt. Mere participation in the extermination infrastructure was sufficient. Meanwhile, newly opened Soviet and Allied archives revealed the extent to which Cold War politics had previously shielded some SS men. Files created for espionage were now repurposed as evidence. Investigative journalists and independent researchers brought long-lost perpetrators back into the public eye. In response, Germany passed legislation removing statutes of limitations on crimes against humanity. The legal framework evolved to reflect a sobering truth. Time did not erase culpability, and justice, though delayed, was still worth pursuing. Beyond courtrooms, public memory evolved too. Memorials were expanded, curricula rewritten, and testimonies of survivors became core to national education. Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were no longer just ruins. They became sites of warning. Museums like Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum centered personal stories of victims, bystanders, and perpetrators. These efforts dismantled the myth of the SS as monolithic evil, instead revealing the terrifying normalcy of its ranks. Yet the battle over memory wasn't one-sided. Extremist propaganda, especially in the digital age, began recirculating sanitized or glorified portrayals of the SS. Denialism crept into fringe discourse. Conspiracy theorists distorted historical evidence. In this context, remembrance became an act of resistance. The legacy of the SS, then, is not just about the horrors it committed, it is also about how societies chose to remember, ignore, justify, or confront them. The post-war journey from denial to confrontation was slow and fraught, but essential. Ultimately, this legacy teaches us that the aftershocks of organized evil don't end with surrender. They persist in legal ambiguity, in ideological residue, and in the ongoing challenge of ensuring never again is more than a slogan. Reckoning with the SS is a continuing process, one rooted not just in history, but in vigilance. Has the reckoning with SS crimes ever truly been complete? And how do we preserve historical truth when time and politics threatens to obscure it?